and welcome to week 28 of Human Circulation and Gas Exchange. My name is Jonathan Green, and today we are going to be looking at blood plasma and tissue fluid. In order to understand today's topics, we are going to compare the similarities and differences between the components and functions of blood plasma and tissue fluid. So we're going to compare both what blood plasma and tissue fluid are made up of, and look at the similarities and differences, equally looking at the functions of both types of fluids as well, and looking at the similarities and differences equally. And ultimately, the second part of the outcome to cover today is to apply what you've learned via distinguishing the differences between blood plasma and tissue fluid by completing pages 11 of your e-workbook. So in terms of our scheme of work, currently we are on week 28. So essentially speaking, we've just been off for April vacation for 2 weeks. I hope that you've all been safe and well over that period, and you are well rested and recovered. For those that are key working or have got responsibilities over this time with children, things like that, I hope that you're okay, safe and well as well. Next week we'll be looking at pulmonary ventilation and the adaptations of the respiratory system to gas exchange. Essentially speaking, that is the final topic for this unit. And then essentially speaking, we've got VE Day the following week, and then assignment workshops leading into our handing day, which is scheduled for the 22nd of May. Obviously, due to this current situation, the resubmissions windows are no longer applicable. Equally, all assignments now are classed as formative assessments. So I've sent you all an email previous to this and ensure that you've all managed to receive that regarding these final units becoming calculated grades. If you need any more information on that, then what I'll do is I'll put a link on Google Classroom so that you can see the publishing and the published statement from the Quality Assurance Agency. If anyone has got any questions on that as well, like you have been doing, just get in touch. So last week's YouTube lecture is available on Google Classroom, as well as this week's will be going on shortly. Ultimately, this is actually before Easter, so it's not last week's, it's probably 3 weeks ago, but it's on there if you need to refresh your memory about the components of blood, the structure and function of red blood cell, and also some extra reading behind blood groups, blood types, and things like that. So this week's topic, first of all, we'll be looking at blood plasma. So before I start progressing on to the actual components and functions of blood plasma, what I want you to do is just maybe take a pause by clicking pause on this video and try and think about what you already know about blood plasma. What do you know? Okay, so actually, what is blood plasma? So ultimately, when the formed elements are removed from blood, these are otherwise known as white blood cells, platelets, red blood cells, for example, and placed through a centrifuge, or if you just put whole blood into a centrifuge, it'll separate into the diagram on the right hand side. And ultimately what you'll be left with in either case is a straw-coloured liquid, and that ultimately is blood plasma. Blood plasma is composed in terms of just over 90% of water, and the rest is solutes, ultimately molecules within this solution, most of which are what's called proteins, electrolytes, nutrients, hormones, enzymes and waste products. And ultimately the function of plasma is to take nutrients, hormones and proteins to the parts of the body that need it. And also cells put their waste products into plasma as well, which is through a process, a much broader process such as bulk flow, which we don't cover. But if you do want any extra readings surrounding that, then ultimately that's the topic that you need to look at. And also blood plasma is the transport medium that ultimately allows blood to be transported throughout the whole of your body via your circulatory system. Plasma plays a critical part of the treatment pathways for many serious health conditions. So that's why we have blood donation services. Some of you might already donate blood. Some of you might already know your blood type as a result of donating blood. If so, our topic that we covered last, a couple of weeks ago now on blood, you might be able to take a look at your blood types and look at how many or how rare or popular your blood types are. As with these other components and solutes, we also carry what's called antibodies and clotting factors. So these are very important and can be vital parts that can be removed and concentrated into certain treatments. And these products can then be used to help save lives of people maybe suffering from burns, shock, trauma, infection, which is something that we're going to look quite closely at, and other medical emergencies. So ultimately, we can see this diagram here, and specifically we're going to be looking at whole blood, and then specifically looking at the top in shaded yellow, which is plasma. So as you can see here, 55% of whole blood is made of blood plasma. Plasma is made up of just over 90% of water, proteins, and which are solutes still, and equally other solutes as well. So what is the link between antibodies which are contained within blood plasma and COVID-19? Well, antibodies are proteins produced by plasma cells in our blood plasma in response to a specific antigen. Antigens are substances that have the ability to trigger an immune response, and these can be found within pathogens such as COVID-19, and these can react or not react with our antibodies. It's hopeful that antibodies combine with the antigen to neutralise or destroy it, but if this is a new or foreign pathogen, our immune system will hopefully attach to the antigen and ultimately, as a result of that, create new antibodies in a process what's called acquired immunity. So you might have seen this gentleman on the news. This is Professor Chris Whitty. He is the Chief Medical Officer for NHS England, and quite recently he's mentioned serology testing comes into play in a very important way, as you may have heard on the government's daily briefings. Serology is ultimately testing fluid components of the body in a very, very simple way to put it. So what do you actually mean by serology testing? Now, the overall aim of these types of tests are to try and find out, essentially speaking, have you had the infection by developing antibodies. Now, the overall aim in epidemiology is trying to find out in a much more larger population to try and prevent an outbreak from either reoccurring or to ultimately prevent the spread of it, which is why we're all currently socially distancing at the minute to try and reduce the spread. The overall aim is to try and find out how many of the population have had the infection and developed antibodies to it. And ultimately, by developing antibodies, it's hoped that you will have some level of immunity. However, only 2 to 3% of populations have developed antibodies so far as a result of contracting COVID-19. So even if you have become infected, the likelihood of becoming infected again may still be high because your body hasn't developed this acquired immunity. Jackie will go through the non-specific and specific responses to infection, otherwise known as acquired immunity and infection immunity, so I'm not going to dwell too much on that process, but ultimately when Jackie will go on to doing that, obviously if you are very interested in looking at that process, which is very pertinent at the minute, then please do so. So the next part of this week's topic is looking at tissue fluid. So what do you already know about tissue fluid is the question. I'd recommend that you pause this YouTube video, start to think of things that you might already know about tissue fluid. What is it? Where do you think it is? What is it composed of? What is its function? And sometimes a clue is within the names of these key terms. So understanding key terminology. So tissue fluid can be otherwise known as interstitial or extracellular fluid. Now sometimes if we do call a tissue fluid an extracellular fluid, sometimes we can confuse terms with other extracellular fluids. So extracellular fluid within blood vessels, for example, is known as blood plasma. Ultimately, extracellular means outside of a cell. Extracellular fluid within lymphatic vessels is known as lymph. Extracellular fluid within the brain and spinal cord is known as cerebral spinal fluid. But linking to what we're wanting to look at today, the extracellular fluid that bathes cells and is tissues that surrounds the cells is known as tissue or interstitial fluid, and this is what we'll be looking more closely at. So, for the proper function of our body's cells, they require the precise regulation and composition of a fluid that surrounds them, tissue fluid. Because of this, it is often referred to our body's internal environment. You've got to remember that predominantly a lot of our body is composed of water. Ultimately, this water is a fluid. Some of that fluid will be tissue fluid. And tissue fluid communicates and permeates the spaces between the cells, has contact with the cells and other fluids such as blood plasma and also lymphatic lymphatic fluid such as lymph, and this helps transport oxygen, nutrients, chemicals and waste to and from the body's cells to give it the nutrients and goodness that it needs, as well as removing the waste products that come as a result of metabolism or respiration. In terms of the components of tissue fluid, it closely resembles blood plasma in its composition. Ultimately, our body has adapted to transport things that are both good and bad for our body. But ultimately, generally what we transport as things that are useful are generally used by the body. So tissue fluid resembles plasma in the fact that our cells need oxygen. It also needs to have the ability to remove carbon dioxide. It contains sugars for cellular processes to function, just like we need sugars and carbohydrates for energy. It contains salts, amino acids for cellular growth, hormones, enzymes, white blood cells, and it also carries waste products such as urea. However, tissue fluid does not contain red blood cells. They stay within the capillaries and blood vessels themselves, or much larger plasma proteins. Another difference is blood plasma is a much higher pressure than tissue fluid. And ultimately that is at the arterial end of a capillary. Processes or substances move in and out of a capillary in a process called bulk flow due to a pressure gradient. Now, for substances to move across a membrane, in this case a capillary, ultimately it needs to be at a higher pressure to a lower pressure. So if the capillaries are at a higher pressure than our cells, ultimately substances will move across that permeable membrane. And ultimately that means that substances like oxygen, sugars, salts, amino acids, hormones, enzymes, white blood cells, if applicable, if we've got an infection, can move across that membrane. At the opposite end, ultimately the venous end of a capillary, ultimately tissue fluid needs to remove these waste products. And that, again, is because tissue fluid is a much higher pressure, and at the venous end, the pressure is much lower, and that allows substances to move back into the blood and allowed to be removed as waste. So ultimately, we have got two tasks to complete. So learning outcome 1 is a Google doc that you have to complete in comparing the components of fluids of blood plasma and tissue fluid, which I'm going to cover just in a short while. And learning outcome 2 is to apply what you've learned by completing page 11 of your workbook, which distinguishes between blood plasma and tissue fluid. So using the literature titled on Google Classroom, Components of Blood, Structure and Function of Red Blood Cell, there's a lot of good information about blood plasma on there, as well as literature, tissue fluid. There is 2 different forms of literature there for you to look at, as well as your own independent research. Complete the following tasks. So under week 28, there is a formative assessment called Comparing Blood Plasma and Tissue Fluid. It is a Google Doc worksheet for you to complete. What I want you to do is distinguish between plasma and tissue fluid by defining the difference, what is blood plasma, what is tissue fluid, and then also distinguish the differences between comparing the components of plasma and tissue fluid, and also compare the functions of plasma and tissue fluid as well. And once you've done that, submit and hand in for feedback. Once you've been given feedback, obviously that'll help inform you with this next outcome, which is applying what you've learned to distinguish between plasma and tissue fluid. And ultimately, once you've applied that, you'll be able to complete pages 11 of your e-workbook. As a hint, utilise learning outcome 1's task. These are today's references that I have used for compiling this YouTube e-lecture. And next week we are going to be looking at pulmonology, our last topic for human circulation and gas exchange. We are going to be looking at pulmonary ventilation and the adaptations of the lungs and lung tissues to perform efficient gas exchange. Thank you very much. See you all next week.